Welcome to another monthly conversation with Konstantin Samoilov, who many of you will know as one of the most respected voices on YouTube about what is happening inside Russia. Konstantin is a well-known YouTuber whose channel Inside Russia comments insightfully on Russia's descent into authoritarianism over the last few years. Now, of course, like many, he's outside Russia. He could not produce the videos he produces. He could not have the strong, independent, critical, and analytical voice that he does have if he was still based in Russia. And of course, many who've watched his channel are very grateful indeed that he is able to at least lift the lid a little bit on what's going on and help us to understand perhaps some of the internal politics, especially at this time, that are going on within the Russian hierarchy and within Russian society. If you enjoy this video or if you find it useful, because perhaps enjoy is not the right word for some of the serious stuff we're going to be talking about, please definitely make sure you're subscribe to Konstantin's channel. Help us both out by buying a coffee if you can. It really does help support the work that we do on the channel and the content we try to produce daily during what I think is incredibly historic times. And again, this episode, we're going to have to only tackle, I think, a fraction of the topics that we'd like to. Konstantin, I'm delighted to welcome you back. And this is perhaps going to be one of the most interesting, possibly even important discussions that we'll have had to date.
Jonathan, thank you so very much for having me. It's great to be back for another conversation. I always enjoy them, and I think today is going to be a very exciting one. Before we start, I'd like to congratulate you on reaching the first serious milestone on YouTube. You reached 100,000 subscribers mark. That's a silver button. This is just shows that your channel has grown to become a great place to get food for thought. I really enjoy logging in and watching and listening to your guests of your channel. It's fantastic stuff. Congratulations.
Thank you, Konstantin. Very, very kind and generous words there. That play button arrived this morning, so I'm going to have to try and find a way to work it into the background of these videos. But I think it's maybe the first thing I've done that my son has been genuinely impressed by. So
enjoy, because I
enjoy
have
the
not
moment.
received mine. This is going to be my fourth one soon, but I have not received mine because I'm Russian and they don't send it to Russians.
That's such a shame. Hopefully, one day it will find its way to you because that's
I
a
hope
magical
so.
moment, well deserved. Well, I think we had a chat before we started recording to agree the certain themes and, of course, to align on a certain point of view. And I think actually both of us are aligned in that what is happening at the moment is an incredibly historic moment. And I think we're both aligned that what Ukraine has done, and it's difficult to find the right words, it is not an invasion, it's perhaps a counter invasion or even a liberation of Russian territory. But what Ukraine is doing, to my mind, is incredibly momentous, and it is a huge psychological blow. It seems, however, from looking at many pundits in the West and much Western media, that the scale, seriousness, and potential repercussions aren't really sinking in. But I want to throw this over to you. What is unfolding, and how important is it?
First of all, I don't understand why pundits in the West do not realize what's really going on. It's been 7 days since a foreign state, Ukraine, rolled its troops into Russian territory. Okay, it hasn't happened in Russian history since World War II. And the entire Russian propaganda has been selling this idea to Russian people. The idea of stability and safety. All right, we're going to take your rights, some of the rights. Okay, but instead, we're going to give you stability and safety. So you're going to be completely safe and stable. And now, a foreign state, I'm just giving you the facts, enters Russia and occupies a great chunk of territories where is the stability? Where is safety? What's going on? Okay, and this is just the beginning. This is such huge event. Okay, I don't understand why it's not appreciated by the Western media. Ukraine does not have a goal of occupying an entire Russia. I think it's impossible. Russia is a huge country, but Ukraine has successfully done what it has successfully done is it set things in motion in Russia. And right now it's the most important thing, okay? The biggest changes are taking place inside the Kremlin as we speak right now, okay? We are seeing them. We're seeing the smoke, we're not seeing the fire because fire is well hidden behind the curtains, but there's plenty of smoke and there's no smoke without fire. Okay, Ukrainians have changed everything by this, I don't know, is it the right word to say intrusion into Russia? Rolling into Russia, you know, they changed everything. They've gained so much. This is their biggest victory in the entire war in 2.5 years. So I think this is the most exciting moment of this 2.5-year-old long war. So I don't know. You asked me questions, good.
I'll fire
I
a
can go
question at you.
on for a couple of hours talking about it.
Well, I think one of the most, again, this hasn't really, this got just a vague mention in some of the newspapers, barely, and it's perhaps because they don't understand who these figures are and they don't understand the internal politics within Russia. But the potential replacement of Gerasimov, someone who's come up through the military hierarchy, the replacement of him by an FSB agent, Bortnikov. I mean, this is a seismic and significant change that I believe will not lead to any military success, but it will lead to an injection of KGB tactics on the ground. And we can only imagine what those might be, provocations, murders, all sorts of things that are perhaps too horrific to contemplate for those who believe that the apartment bombings that started Putin's regime were engineered by the FSB, and there are many who think that is the case. By injecting these same sort of KGB mindset into the military, this seems to me a huge, momentous, and potentially very dangerous moment for Putin's regime. But again, it's barely got a mention in much of the analysis that I've tried to be reading up on.
Jonathan, I am very surprised by that because I think what you mentioned is the biggest success that Ukrainians have achieved. Okay, let me take a step back. Any democracy, any democratic system, state, to remain democracy needs a system of checks and balances. Okay, once such system of checks and balances fails, then democracy falls into totalitarianism. There have been so many examples in human history. Probably the biggest example is the Roman Republic turning into the Roman Empire. Well, that's a known fact about the system of checks and balances, but less known fact is that any dictator also has his own system of checks and balances. The USSR did have the system of checks and balances. There was a triangle: the army, the federal police, and the KGB. And Politburo, this bunch of old men who claimed to be communists, which they weren't, they were the controllers, the supervisors. They were making sure that each agency, the KGB, the army, and the police, were about equal in power, and they made sure all agencies were in constant total war with each other. And they maintained this fragile balance. Vladimir Putin is a child of that system. He was born, grew up, and matured in that system. He knows he was one of the KGB people. He knows the system. It's in his blood. Okay, so when he got into power, first thing he started doing, he started rebuilding that system of old Soviet checks and balances. And, he succeeded. He tweaked it a little bit, and it's called the vertical of power. I've talked about it many times. And the vertical of power, actually, the system that has helped him to remain in power for 24 years. Well, this system is crumbling right now. And the straw that is breaking camel's back is the Ukrainian intrusion. Forgive me if I am using the wrong word. I don't really understand the meanings, the moods of these words. Okay, the Ukrainians role in, it's definitely not invasion. Okay, it's perhaps it's counter-offensive. Let's put it this way. So they are breaking this system of checks and balances, Putin's system, by rolling into Russian territory. Okay, and this is the most important thing that they have achieved. Taking Russian territories, well, I don't know. In my mind, it's what's going on inside the Kremlin now as a result of what Ukrainians are doing near Kursk. Okay, and this is in front of our eyes. I don't understand why people are not paying attention to that. I find it extremely important. Just look, Gerasimov, the chief of general staff, he was considered one of Russia's brightest generals. Okay, he miserably failed, but still he was strong enough to control the Russian armed forces. He was number one. Shoigu was never a general. Shoigu, he's a construction worker, basically. He's a manager. My former colleague used to work with Sergei Shoigu back in the 70s, early 80s in Sayanogorsk. They were building aluminum foil facility, production facility. So he told me a thing or two about Shoigu. He's not a military man. He's not a general, but Gerasimov is. Gerasimov is a career military man, and he's general. He grew up from the bottom to the top. And Gerasimov outlived Shoigu. For some reasons, there are rumors, but I don't know which one is true. But he outlived Shoigu. He outskilled them in this, power game. And Vladimir Putin, 2 days ago, fires Shoigu and places the head of the KGB, Bortnikov, in place of him. For the first time in Russia's history, power got consolidated in the hands of the KGB chief. And this is the end for everyone. This is the end for the army. This is the end for Putin, for this government. And I couldn't believe Putin did that, okay? And Putin is not novice in this power game. I think he understood very well what he was doing. And the thing is, Zug Zwang, he didn't have a choice. Every single move he would make would place him into a worse position. So had he not replaced Gerasimov, he would have Ukrainians near Moscow in no time, I think. Okay, so in Russia, they say to make a choice between a lesser evil. So I think he made a choice between lesser evil, but then this lesser evil, placing Bortnikov in place, in charge of armed forces. People say, well, he's not in charge of the entire armed forces. No, but he's in charge of the special counter-terrorism operation that Putin announced, and that gives him power over the armed forces in the 3 provinces. And the counter-terrorism operation usually is not announced. Well, it happens once in a while, but it happens on small territory, like a county in the United States, little district. But this time it's 3 large provinces, the entire Western Russia, okay? And the KGB chief is in charge of everything there. On top of that, he makes decisions to move troops out of Ukraine back into Russia to fight the Ukrainians in Russia. So that gives him control over the troops in Ukraine. This is pure, absolute power, okay? I couldn't believe Putin did that. Well, something happened because 24 hours passed and Putin fired Bortnikov and placed his bodyguard, former bodyguard, in charge of the armed forces. You don't do that. You don't change these people in this position, pretty much the top power position, every 24 hours. That shows that you're panicking. It shows that you are not sure about your decisions. You make a choice, you make a decision, and then 24 hours later, you change your mind. You don't do that if you're a dictator. When you're a strong man, you don't do that, okay? It shows the entire world that Putin either has lost control or he's not assessing the information right, or he's not getting the right information feeds, or something extremely odd is going on, okay? And this is huge, huge. And no one knows why. Right now, it's very, not confidential, but it's behind very tightly closed doors, okay? We will find out sooner or later because there will be people who will come out and speak about it. But right now, it doesn't matter why. We're seeing the results, and that's enough. Putin is panicking. He runs around and, shuffles people of the highest position. You can't do that. You place that guy in charge, and he needs to stay. You need to make a choice so carefully because the guy needs to stay there for years. That's how you keep the stability of your system. And Putin has lost it. And this is the most important thing right now. And I am truly surprised that not too many people talking about it. So
it is extraordinary, isn't it? And when that moment comes, we wake up and we find that Putin has fallen out of a window, or he has retired to his dacha, and a bunch of people are taking over whose names we're not so familiar with. The media are going to turn around and go like, well, nobody saw this coming. Who could have predicted this? It was like a Soviet Union moment. But as you say, there are tectonic movements currently in play. And Ukraine has triggered it. Ukraine has made it impossible now for anybody in the Russian elite, within the Siloviki class, to imagine they will be victorious in the war, to imagine that the war comes with no consequences. Everyone, I think, now realizes that it's a question of either, a catastrophe or a disaster or something of biblical proportions. It's now the scale of catastrophe that can be perhaps slightly mitigated or controlled, not the actual outcome. And another interesting question that immediately came to my mind, which again is not really talked about much, is that Russia does not have the capacity to move a ton of troops from the east and the south. One, it would weaken those fronts. Two, they're just not that mobile in terms of being able to move things, large amounts of armor or troops. They don't have that capacity. They don't have that logistical capability. So it's forcing them into decisions that they haven't wanted to make for 2.5 years, which is mobilization of the urban population. Ukraine is trying to force Putin, I think, into taking that decision as a last resort, because I think Ukraine understands that when he does take that decision, that will also bring this entire system crashing down. You will see people conscripted into the army by force, and you will see them surrendering en masse without firing a shot, delivering up their equipment to the Ukrainians, which will make the sort of 1,000-odd prisoners that have been taken in the last couple of days look like a trickle. You'll have a flood of people defecting. Again, this is where I feel things are going. I'm not sure if you sort of think that is one of the motivations behind the Ukrainian action.
I think the Ukrainians have a few goals, and I think what you mentioned, is one of the goals, because clearly, how do I say that? Russia is in deep trouble. There's a perfect storm spinning on top of Russia, in every area of life, in the economy, including in the military. All right. There was a mobilization conducted 2 years ago, September, October, November of 2022. According to the Military of Defense, around a little over 300,000 Russian men were mobilized. And then mobilization didn't stop. Only it slowed down, and they started buying people. They were offering them, they've been offering ever increasing signing bonuses and salary, high salary. Okay, and then I think it's safe to say that another 400,000, at least 100,000 Russian men actually bought this idea and signed up for money to go and fight in Ukraine. Unfortunately, but that's truth. So the thing is, there hasn't been any big influx of men into the armed forces since late 2022. And people who were mobilized, they've been at the front lines for almost 2 years now, without rotation, okay, without proper clothing, proper arms. And, from what we understand, Russian army is in extremely poor shape right now. Okay, they are exhausted mentally and physically, and it's really hard to fight when you're exhausted mentally and physically, and you don't really know what you're fighting for, because money doesn't really cut it. Okay, and at this point, Russia is already extremely exhausted in terms of men in Ukraine, and boom, the Ukrainians roll into Kursk province, and all of a sudden, hundreds of thousands of more Russian military men are the troops needed, and there's simply nowhere to take them. You take them from Ukraine, you move them to Kursk. Well, what happens to the front lines in Ukraine? I'm pretty sure Ukrainians are waiting for that. Okay, you start moving conscripts from all over Russia, but you don't have that many left, because they are taking part in the war, what they call special military operation. Okay, perhaps not on the front lines, but near the borders. And Russia and Ukraine have a very long border. And Putin is facing a very tough choice. And you are absolutely right. I think so. That the Russian armed forces either going to fail miserably in the front lines, or it needs new men. There's no way around it. Okay, according to the reports that I've been getting from the insiders in Russia, in the last every area, every province has conscription and mobilization centers. There's people in charge of mobilization, and they're part of the armed forces, and they have plans given to them how many men they need to mobilize to bring in, make soldiers. And in the last months, their plans were only made 1/3. So basically, they would only produce 30% of men they were supposed to, according to the plans given from Moscow. Okay, and that's a pretty dire situation. And now they need many more men. So Putin, if he lasts that long, then in my estimation, from 10 to 16, 18 weeks, perhaps even earlier, 8 to 16 weeks, he will be forced to announce some kind of mobilization, another partial, full mobilization, or declare war, do something that would change situation with the troop. But once he does that, oh boy, that's a very unpopular decision. The situation will become uncontrollable, and that's my bet.
And who knows what the Ukrainians are planning over the coming weeks? Because again, many Western analysts have used words like raid. Of course, that's completely wrong. I mean, it's
Not
far
a
more
raid,
substantial than a raid. It's not a raid at all. It
not a
has
raid.
no, and that that word, that phrase embodies the underestimation of Ukrainian resourcefulness and strength and capacity to plan actually and learn from the various mistakes that have been made over the last 2.5 years. So I suspect we will see them digging in to the territories they've taken. I suspect we will see those extended quite dramatically, probably into Belgorod and down into Bryansk and maybe further. But already a very interesting act took place, and this really ties in with, I think, what we'll talk about in a second, which is the economy. They went out on a limb to where one of the Gazprom substations is, one of the most important pumping units that is critical for the supply of gas into Western Europe. And of course, we know there are some countries in Western Europe who are still consuming Russian gas, and they destroyed that critical Gazprom facility. So again, there are multiple aims and objectives, it seems. This one is quite a big one, I think, destroying critical energy infrastructure, energy export infrastructure.
Well, there's one thing to consider. They have not destroyed the facility itself. The facility meaning the pumping station, but they have destroyed the pipes leading to this piping station. Pumping, not piping, pumping station with big, large pumps. I remember my company about 15 years ago, we were part of a construction project on one of such pump stations in Belgorod region province. So they've destroyed the pipes leading to it, and the pipes can be easily and quickly replaced. They can be connected again to the facility. Facility has not been destroyed because it's really tough, costly, and a very long process to restore or rebuild the facility itself. But pipes, not that big of a deal. And yes, they do control the situation. They have an upper hand in the trade, obviously. And this is insane, but the Russian army cannot do anything about it. They've been not even trying for the past 7 days. A raid, for goodness sake, what kind of raid lasts for 7 days? Raid is something you're in, you're out. You do something, blow up an airport or destroy some military facility, reach your goal, and you're out. This isn't the raid. This is a counteroffensive. The first thing Ukrainians did when they captured part of the Kursk province, they started building fortifications. On the very first day, this isn't the raid. This is a skillfully planned operation, counter-offensive operation.
Absolutely. I'm going to do some episodes on this as well because it seems they have used some very innovative electronic warfare techniques that allowed this mobility as well to happen, which is a genuine kind of blitzkrieg kind of technique. But if we look at the economy as well, it seems that this is a perfect storm brewing here. I know we both watch commentators such as Vladimir Milov, Michael Naki, and others, and the tempo of videos that they've been producing about the Russian economy and the severity of what they're talking about seems to really be accelerating quite dramatically. Now, the news that interest rates are heading up to 18%, but are very unlikely to actually bring inflation under control. It's no longer within the remit, I think, of the central bank to really manage an economy that is flying apart like this one, that has too little manpower, too much cash or money chasing too few goods. It seems that there's a perfect storm of problems. And I know we've discussed these before, but even some of the central bankers in Russia, even some of the leading economists are actually going on record. They're still in Russia, and yet they're making videos essentially saying that the economy is absolutely screwed, which I find quite extraordinary.
I've been talking about this pretty much since the war started because I'm economist by trade and I understand how economy works. I understand the dynamics. And I've been forecasting the demise of Russian economy. I made a mistake on timing. I thought that things would get better by the end of 2022, but well, there were circumstances. There were reasons for Russian economy not to collapse then. And we discussed it many times. And then what I'm seeing right now is it's even worse than I thought it would be. Okay, it's collapsing. It's collapsing everywhere. What's happening right now, trust me, it's not helping Russian economy whatsoever. Okay. At this point, there are hundreds of thousands of Russian people displaced, and that's a huge economic loss because you need, first of all, they stopped working and producing, adding and stopped adding value to Russian economy. They've stopped paying taxes. They've stopped getting, earning money. Businesses, I don't even know what's going to happen there. They don't exist anymore. They existed 7 days ago, okay? And that's a large territory. There's Russian agriculture has taken a huge hit because obviously the crops, there will be no yield. Russian ruble started losing its value. Although it's not a fiat currency, a central bank is changing the course. The demand for American dollar has grown a great deal in Russia, and Russian ruble losing value means that the inflation is going even higher. There are two little known facts at this point. Russian trade, this trade balance, foreign trade balance, right now it's for the first time in quite a few months, quite a few years, it's become positive, profit, not deficit. It means that Russia sells more and it sells oil and gas still. It receives more money that it spends on foreign goods. Why? Because Russia's two so-called friends and allies, as Putin loves to call them that, Turkey and China have stopped taking Russian money. The banks from those countries have ceased transacting with Russian banks, and therefore Russians cannot buy anything from China or from Turkey. And it's really, especially with China, this is a huge blow to the economy. Therefore, Russian statistics agency Rosstat just released this data, this trading profit. They can't spend money. And you know what it means? In a couple months, empty shelves. Or if not empty shelves, then prices through the roof, then they will be on shelves, but people won't be buying products, things, okay? Today, Russian antitrust agency came up with an announcement that it is forcing three largest retailers of electronics in Russia to not raise prices. And I'm watching with popcorn because I don't know how they can do that. If a private company buys something from China and that something, needs to be sold at a certain price to cover the expenses, how the government will step in and force those companies to sell at price levels lower than the expenses are. So this is these are small details just to show you that Russian economy is not doing well. And this events that are unfolding in Kursk right now, not just in Kursk, in Belgorod too, because they have announced a massive evacuation into districts of Belgorod province. Okay, so that's just another blow to Russian economy. It accelerates the demise, the landslide that the economy is going through right now. And
This is
again, I'm
another
surprised they're not talking about it much.
No, I have to turn to, I mean, there's one or two YouTubers who are, and I think this is where there's been some interesting comments that YouTubers who've been talking about this, every day for the last couple of years seem to be ahead of the mainstream media on this. But I'm turning to Russian language sources really to get this information because I'm not really finding what I would consider adequate or in-depth analysis from other sources. Um, and this is another effect of Ukrainians' incursion, as it were, into Russia. If you look at a traditional economy on a kind of micro level, if it looks like a retailer is going to go bust or isn't going to pay its bills, well, you stop supplying that retailer. On a macro level, that seems to be what Turkey and China are doing. Their ally, they're now, I think, suspecting that Russia at some point in time will not be able to pay its bills, and they are limiting their exposure and liability in that situation. I'm not convinced that it's a geopolitical decision because they've shown a certain amount, I say, of indifference to the invasion. If the invasion was successful, I think they would carry on trading. This is perhaps a judgment on Russia's invasion and the potential success of it. I think they now think that there will be no success and there cannot be any success in the invasion, and therefore limiting their liabilities accordingly.
Jonathan, here I must disagree with you, and I'll explain why. From what I see and understand, this is the work of the secondary sanctions, especially with China. Well, both Turkey and China. Turkey is a little different story. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State from America, visited Turkey before New Year, late 2023, and he just warned Turkish banks that if they were to continue doing business with Russians, then they would be placed under American sanctions. And I believe there was a new law created in the USA that would allow the US government, there's a finance commission or this body that is in charge of sanctions to do that, okay, to place sanctions for secondary sanctions on not Russian companies, but on companies who trade with Russia. And then he flew to China, and the Turkish shut down all trade with Russia on January 1st. And he also warned the Chinese banks, and large Chinese banks stopped trading with Russia on Chinese New Year in mid-February. But there were ways how to transfer money to China and to get goods delivered to Russia. Russians used chains of smaller banks in different countries, such as Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Uzbekistan, and they traded with small Chinese banks. Okay, and then Blinken traveled second time, warned again, and I think there's been this informational campaign going on, from the side of the Americans. And what happened is the Chinese finally realized that Americans mean business, and if they keep on trading with Russian companies or individuals who are placed under sanctions, then they are at risk of getting kicked off of the international financial system. And for a bank, it's death, okay? And the problem is they don't know how to distinguish who is under sanctions and who is not in Russia, because you might be selling, taking money, transferring, dealing with a legitimate company in Russia. You think it's legitimate, but in reality, it's just a front for somebody who is under sanctions. And then you're in trouble. So the Chinese looked at the volume of trade they do, and Russia is just a small percentage. So therefore, it doesn't make any sense for them to risk their well-being, okay, to risk being placed on American sanctions for trading, for doing small volume of trade with Russia. So they just decided to pragmatically to just minimize the risks. That's it. That's my story. That's how I see the situation.
And I hear anecdotally, again, this is very difficult to get detailed evidence of this, but a return to what we saw in the 1990s, which is the return of individuals crossing borders to bring things with them, whether they're goods or electronic components for the military, but a devolution from large logistic networks down to individuals. I think you'll remember hauling these big IKEA style cases and sacks and bring stuff across borders. That shows perhaps a certain degeneration of the import export environment, and it shows a certain perhaps desperation on the part of the state, who's going to be giving these individuals probably above market prices for these components and stuff, but also a desperation of the people who are doing this. This is probably going to be paying a lot better than some jobs if they can get them.
Do I remember that? Jonathan, my mom went to Poland and Romania, once to Poland, once to Romania, in 1990, okay, to do that. In Russia, it was called челночество, the shuttling. So basically, you just buy a bunch of stuff, what you hope is in demand in Poland. You take a large bag, you jump on the bus, they take you to Poland, you try to sell whatever you have and buy what is in demand. Everything was in demand. Okay, you buy like T-shirts or hats or whatever. You come back to Soviet Union and you sell it. So I think the first time she went, I think it was Poland, and she brought home $136 because she sold the stuff she bought in Poland even before reaching Rostov. So she showed us $136. It's for the first time in my life I saw American dollars, and it was fortune. Back then, it was fortune. You could buy so much for it. So I remember that well. And when the USSR fell apart, we felt happy because that was in the past. We left it in the past, okay? And we grew out of it. We grew out of taking large bags, very heavy bags, and taking them to Romania, Poland, selling and bringing money so we could get by. Russia was, no matter how difficult for us it was to live, since 1992, our lives were better than the USSR, and they were becoming better and better. The living standard was growing. And sadly enough, we are into the square one. Because you're absolutely right. I also have heard reports that people who live not too far from China, they started doing this very same thing, челночить. So to do shuttling, take, probably they take dollars and then buy things in China and then bring and resell. And that's not because Russian retail is doing, thriving. It's because there's a need for that. That's because things started disappearing. It's because this way of doing business, micro business, is in demand again. And it is sad. It is very sad. That's what we're trying to break away from. And 30 years later, we're back to the square one. Putin has done an incredible job of just destroying Russia, okay? And when I talk about today a lot, I talk about yesterday because I try to find reasons why today, why we have become today. But when I look into the future, it's so dark, it scares me.
One note, hopefully, of optimism. I have to ask, do you remain optimistic and positive that Ukrainian forces operating on the territory of Russia will treat Russian civilians with mercy and kindness, the kind of things that have not been shown to them? From what you see, what you hear, what you know of Ukrainians from your own direct experience, do you remain optimistic that they will adhere to the rules of war and will treat the Russians they find with humanity?
I believe in Ukrainians. I know Ukrainians well. I spent 1 year in Ukraine. I worked for a Ukrainian company. Still have tons of friends in Ukraine. Um, they're good people, you know. They're just I I can't imagine them doing atrocities to Russians. And I have not seen one report of person being killed on purpose, in a sadistic manner. Obviously, there are so many civilians that have been killed, but I don't believe that they were killed just for the sake of killing. Okay. On the contrary, I've seen reports of Ukrainians driving by in Kursk, towns and villages, and talking to locals, and locals talking to them. So that's just um, proves that they're Ukrainians, not nice people, not animals. Okay, their country was invaded, has been invaded, and they're trying to defend their land, their families, their country. So no, I don't believe they're going to be doing that.
It's good to hear that. It's good to hear you have that confidence. Here's the last question. I know we could talk for hours on this because I think what is happening is extraordinarily historic. And this is a sort of question that no historian will really answer, but very much I think it's in the mind of this Ukrainian campaign to accelerate the collapse of the Putin regime. That I think is one of the clear things. Yes, a lot of the Western pundits have focused on the idea that this is to better position Ukrainians for negotiations, etc., etc. I actually think most Ukrainians understand that they cannot negotiate with the Putin regime, that they cannot make accommodations with it, no matter how obsessed the West seems to be with the idea of achieving a just peace with the current regime. That I think is absurd to most Ukrainians. So it seems to me their tactic is to accelerate the collapse of Putin's regime. I think they may well be successful in doing that. What more do you think needs to happen to bring that to fruition, the full and total collapse or removal of Putin? I mean, who knows what happens next? But what more should the West be doing? What more could Ukraine do? What more could perhaps Russians who oppose the regime be doing to accelerate this moment?
Well, Jonathan, I think that perhaps there's already enough been done. Okay, and then the things have been set in motion. Okay? And then, like I said, we're seeing very odd things that are illogical and they're just unsmart that they're happening. Putin is doing them. I don't think that is very good for his power, for his, hanging to power. What more needs to be done? Well, definitely the West needs to be more firm in its support. Okay. I think that I don't know what Ukrainians can do more that they have done so far. I don't know. I don't know anything about military strategy and military actions. But I think if the West would be more firm in supporting Ukraine and in following up the sanctions and taking a smarter approach to the sanctions, because let's be honest, not all of them are working, and some of them are not working the way that they were meant to be working. So that two elements are crucial.
Absolutely. And as you say, a little bit of firmness on the part of Blinken and others have had incredible knock-on effects.
Not
If they
just
would,
blinking, not just
Mhm.
blinking. You know what? They're trying to act on its own. I think that the more unity needs to be created there, the more coordination, because more coordination, the more effective everything will be.
Definitely, and pushing back on the grey fleet, closing some of the routes whereby components, electronic components for military equipment are still finding their way through. And some European companies are still, through various means, trading machine tools and parts. I mean, that really needs to be sort of clamped down on. I suspect that in our next conversation, I mean, we cannot even predict what may happen in the next couple of weeks. It may be that we need to speak sooner than a month because so much is occurring and events seem to be accelerating towards, I think, some historic moment. But let's see. Let's not try to predict too much of it, because I think many of those predictions will prove proven to be wrong, as so often happens in history. But Konstantin, it's always a massive pleasure speaking to you. It's always also, I think, insightful in a way that few other commentators are. So I know the audience will be incredibly grateful to hear from you once again.
Jonathan, thank you so much. It's always pleasure. Like I said, your channel is a great center where one can get food for thought. Very motivational to watch the speakers, to learn new things, new concepts. I enjoy it very much. So thank you. I think that we are up for a very turbulent, very exciting time. I can't say that I'm happy about that or excited. I'm sad, but it's got to be done. So I think we're going to see a lot, and perhaps we might even speak earlier than usual once a month schedule.
Let's see how things pan out. I rather suspect we'll have plenty to speak about in just a couple of weeks' time. Stay safe, and I hope you and your family stay safe in the current circumstances. And again, massively grateful to the work you're doing and your appearances on this channel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you.